setting up. Right, all good. So I'm going to talk a bit about my game project and a bit about my thesis as well. The game is called This Is How It Is, and so I decided to name this talk This Is How It Is, or How Humorous Computer Game Design Can Build Upon Previous Forms of Political Satire. I will get into that a little bit more in just a sec. I will try to say some of my stuff shortly, slowly, just for the sake of the interpreter, because I'm going to be using some big words and some probably complex themes. So just to give a bit of background, hi, I'm David. And so my background before coming to Goldsmiths was actually more in the programming side of games, but I quickly found that I was very much more passionate about the design and the writing of games. I've had writing as a hobby for a while, but it was within the last few years I started getting into writing comedy. Comedy is very much a lot of trial and error, and I've had plenty of times to fail at being funny before I knew how to actually write something that could make someone laugh. And in the last year, I recently started doing stand-up comedy. I actually started around December time, which suspiciously is the time that coronavirus came about. So I'm not sure whether I've unleashed some kind of horrible curse on this world. But most of my life, I've been a fan of satire. I've watched a lot of satirical TV programs, a lot of satirical films. I've been reading quite a few satire books lately, and it's always been something that I've wanted to attempt myself. So I decided to do it in a game. I took inspirations from other forms of mediums like films. Dr. Strangelove and Sorry to Bother You were two big inspirations. Of course, Dr. Strangelove being a satire of Cold War politics at the time, and Sorry to Bother You being like a satirical critique of capitalism, especially personas that we have to adopt in order to achieve a higher level, ironically, in our satirical system, in our capitalist system even. Getting my words mixed up. I also took some inspiration from games. Everything's Going to Be Okay was definitely a game that showed me just like a new way of looking at comedy in games. It's actually comedy being used to convey some very dark themes as well, especially if you know what the developer was going through at the time that they made this game. And it was kind of looking at how you could communicate some very serious topics but still make it quite humorous. And Mola Industria as well, as a developer, focuses a lot on satire. The screenshot I used there was from a game called Phone Story, which follows the process of making a phone, and it kind of almost hijacks the personality or the persona of the phone or the phone manufacturer to communicate this message about how corrupt and how immoral the process of making a phone actually is. And I took inspirations from literature as well, like Brave New World. And I read a book called Only a Joke Can Save Us, which was very good at explaining the theories of comedy. The difficult part was trying to transfer that over to game design, but yes, that will come later. So as I stated earlier, we like the game tackles some very like big societal themes. One of which is the relationship between politics and capitalism. There's quite a bit of literature out there which talks about how policy decisions are influence the economy, and how the economy also influences politics and decisions that politicians make. I also tackle the discourse between socialism and conservatism, because I can't say for certain how big this topic has been for how long, but at the moment we're kind of seeing more clashes between opposing viewpoints. We're living in a very turbulent time politically, and socialism and conservatism is probably some of like two of the biggest ideologies at the moment. I'm sure someone will correct me about that later, but for me personally, that's just the two that I feel like really contradict each other the most. And of course, I wanted to talk about the unequal democracy of first past the post election systems, which is a electoral system that we have in the UK, and I really feel personally is unfair, as do a lot of other people. At the moment, our current Conservative government holds the majority of seats in the House of Parliament, despite only having 41% of the actual supporting votes. So at some point, you have to look at that. And I think since 1935, 90% of governments have been controlled by one majority party. And in each of those cases, there has not been a single time that they've had a majority of the votes. So they have minority of the votes, but majority of the seats. And you have to look at that and think that something's not quite right there. Something like you're not getting proper political representation. And of course, we have a little cartoon to demonstrate capitalism. I've definitely discovered this. I wish I could have used this in my game, but oh well. I still leave it there because it's very I like the cartoon. So there were some problems for me to tackle from a design and development point of view. I realized I should probably move the camera down so you can actually see me. Hello. First of all, like I mentioned before, was actually comedy in games. Comedy is very much all about comedy works if you have a good structure to it. But when you hand over control to a player, the structure can be skewed. Players sometimes don't follow the structure. It's very difficult to do comedy well in games, which is probably why we don't get a lot of game developers actually attempt it. Another problem is actually trying to present political themes in games. Of course, the good old topic of get your politics out of my game. It's very difficult to get a lot of gamers to open up and listen to quite overt political topics without them getting quite reactionary and quite defensive, especially if the politics is something that they don't necessarily agree with. Another thing I wanted to do with satire in games is to actually try to inspire change, not necessarily actually promote propaganda. There's a fine line to walk between satire and propaganda. Absolutely in no way do I want to brainwash anyone, but I think it's good if political satire can actually inspire people to speak up, to actually act on the politics they are passionate about. And one of the big things was actually bringing something new to political satire. Can games actually provide something that film, television, books, theatre, is there something that games can do that all of those other forms of arts are not capable of doing at this moment? Oh, and as I mentioned, don't make propaganda. And so I decided to doing my research, I found some design tools which really helped. For example, using abstraction and association. I also structured my game around a sequence of arcs. I also catered a lot of the game design to a concept called abusive game design, which sounds bad, but I promise you it's not as bad as it sounds. I will elaborate on all of these as I go along. So abstraction and association. So a lot of this is about, you can think of this as like having metaphors in the game. So for example, all of the characters were animals, and this very much helped with actually, you can draw animal-like behaviors and then assign them to human-like behaviors, and that really helps players to kind of draw these links together. I remember I had one playtester who saw a party of politicians that were all made up of pigs and vultures, and was immediately like, I don't trust them. A gamified political systems, as I mentioned before, about the relationship between politics and capitalism. I was inspired by Mola Industria's talk on video games and the spirit of capitalism, how a lot of game systems can mimic elements of capitalism, and that very much inspired me to then take like elements of game design that mimic capitalism and find connections that I can make to elements of politics that are linked to capitalism, and that very much managed to help build up that association inside the player's mind. I realize now that I should probably read my notes before I make points. I also have the whole game story is set on this island, which is floating and it's been fragmented, and it's meant to symbolize how divided the countries can become by politics. There's an image of it there. That's an earlier version of the island. It's definitely been a lot more populated than that now by houses and trees to kind of make it feel more alive. But from like an early stage in development, I definitely pictured this image of an island that was split apart and divided. And I structured my game, like I said earlier, around something called sequence of arcs. So throughout the game, the gameplay would shift. So you would play putting shapes in the holes in one section, and then later on, you then move on to help a character out with their photo opportunities, so you don't have to take photos, and help them usher away people who won't stop talking to them. And another time you have to gather up some people for a politician's march. So there was a lot of times where it changed, and that actually provided some opportunities to implement comedy into the game design, because players, while they're playing a game, build up like a mental model of how they perceive the game to work. And a great way to create comedy is to subvert what the audience is expecting. This is called incongruity. I'm gonna give the interpreter some time to. No, you got that. Great. Incongruity. Good. So the sequence of arc structure allowed me as a designer to always be subverting the player's expectations by constantly providing like a new game element, a new task, a new type of interaction, a new way to interact with the world, and players like would laugh from the fact that they were not expecting to happen what happens to happen. They were always kept on their toes in a way. Another thing as well is that to build off what I was saying about the mental model, is that I found in my research that humor actually helps to retain information. So there were times where a player might struggle to learn a specific mechanic, but when they do, because the mechanic was humorous, they remembered it, which was great. Also, arcs are just similar to jokes. So if we see here, we have the model and the actions almost serving as the setup, and then the rules and the feedback serving as the payoff for each of the jokes. And I just realized I really need to move on. So abusive game design, so there are different types of abusive game design. We have aesthetic abuse, which is the colors, or sort of like just any way that you can kind of really sort of like throw a lot at the player aesthetically. Lying to the player, which I did quite a bit. So there are a lot of dialogue options that don't go anywhere. And of course, a lot of times where you are presented with a situation and then it turns out that that's not the outcome that they were expected. Unfair gameplay. I think having the gameplay always shifting meant that the players never actually had a full grasp of what was going on in the game. And the purpose of, politics as well. Putting politics in the game is like a way of bleeding the character into like the player's real life character in a way. That's talking about politics usually gets a lot of people motivated, and it definitely gets you to start talking about politics more. And abusive game design serves the purpose of just making you look at the game differently. You're not looking at it as a system to benefit your experience, your gameplay experiences. You're now seeing the gameplay experience as what is the message that the designer's intending here. Here's an example of the game. I can't remember what it's called, GURP or something. I think the game's called GURP, and it's a very difficult game. And at the end, the bird can win the game instead. So what did I find? I will go through these quickly. I'm sorry. So what I found was that sometimes a lot of people are rooted in their ideas, and the game does not influence their perspectives, but it does start discussions. It does motivate players to get talking more about politics, and actually gets them engaged as well, which one participant even mentioned that it could really be a good tool to use in educational settings, getting students to talk more about a topic that they would otherwise not be that interested in. Let's see if I can try and turn the light up. Nope. Okay, never mind. And the great thing about it was that a majority of the people who played it considered it satire. So that's a good result in itself. Mistakes were made though. I'd say definitely a lot of people said that the narrative would have been a lot better if there were more perspectives to work with, so it was less biased, and it might even influence people more if you saw the other side of the story. I focused more on the campaign of one particular party, and it may even have helped the experience and helped the power to influence by showing the other side of the story. And unfortunately, not all games would be able to follow a sequence of arcs type structure. It's better for shorter experiences. And I found that you could probably design something better using loops and arcs instead. And that's it. Thank you. And I look forward to any questions. I'm sorry if that overrun at all. And I'm sorry that I was suddenly going really dark here.
So we've had a couple questions come in. The first one was, where did the idea to slap people away come from?
So yeah, I think this is definitely talking about in the game when you're taking photo opportunities of people, when they won't stop talking to the candidates that has their photos taken, you get to walk over and slap them out the way, and it sends them flying. And idea originally came out as you see a lot of politicians doing these photo opportunities, going on campaigns to talk about why they care so much about these people that they are seeing, and in the end they don't actually care about the people they are standing with. And I thought a good way of showing that was to show that as soon as the photos are taken, they're pretty much just brushed aside.
Another question was, since comedy is highly dependent on timing, how did you pace the presentation of humor?
So the actual story was very structured. I had like a very linear story that led through the whole experience, with moments to diverge from the story to explore these little gameplay elements. So having the narrative structure in there definitely helped, but also kind of found that through the process of the player discovering how the mechanics worked, actually provided its own timing as well. Because sometimes they may not realize that, for example, there's a shapes in the whole game at the beginning of the game, and you get presented with a square hole and a circle hole, and you keep putting squares in the square hole, circle in the circle hole, but then eventually you're given a triangle, and players then aren't sure what to do with the triangle, and they'll try different holes, and they'll realize at the end that there's a knife sitting at the end of the table that they have to cut the corners off the triangle, and the triangle suddenly starts screaming from the pain. And that was just sort of like the time it took for them to realize the solution actually almost provided its own build up, and it was, yeah, it's giving the players the control to build up the suspense and actually working for the payoff for the joke actually worked quite well.
And the last question that's come in so far is abusive gaming something you defined yourself, or is it a predefined research topic in game research?
I wish I could come up with game design concepts, but it's a predefined research topic. I have not seen many people talking about it personally, but it's definitely, I think, because of how subversive it is from the original ideas of game design. It very much, I don't think it's something that is talked about enough.
And I believe those are all of the questions that we have right now.
David, thank you very much for your presentation. You did go a little long, but I won't beat you up about it.
You're coming to kick me out now.
Yeah, well, I mean, we do have other people. And so at this time, I'm going to say so long to David, and we're going to take 5 minutes. So yes, it's going to put us a little bit behind schedule, but I think that's more than reasonable. So we can change out our interpreters and get set up for our next presenter. So I'll see you in just a few minutes.